This is SoundNotion, the weekly podcast for new music and music news. I'm Patrick Gullo.
I'm Dave McDonald.
I'm Sam Merciers.
And I'm Nate Blayton.
And joining us this morning is New York-based composer Tristan Perich, which we just learned this morning is how he actually says his name. Tristan, of course, part of Bang on a Cantaloupe crowd, and awesome tinkerer. Tristan, thank you so much for being on the show this morning.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me. Hey, guys.
We're big fans of yours. I recently, about a year ago, picked up a copy of, or maybe not less than a year ago, picked up a copy of One Bit Symphony from Cantaloupe, which is a really amazing thing. And I know it's not the first piece like that you did, but can you maybe explain to us your kind of relationship with electronic music and the kind of this very specific kind of electronic music that you involve yourself with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's like kind of a big question, but
yeah. Well, just for those that don't know you, I guess maybe kind of introduce yourself.
Well, I work with. Lately, I've been working a lot with microprocessors to generate extremely lo-fi electronic sound, and microprocessors are basically very, very small, inexpensive microchips that are, in essence, entire computers, or at least the processor in a computer, but in a sort of small form factor that you can program and develop for, and they're very inexpensive. And so I've been sort of, I mean, my background's in music, but sorry, I'm not saying this very well because I'm right. A lot of these ideas. Basically, I just sort of fell in love with extremely lo-fi sound, this one-bit sound, which is the sound of on and off pulses of electricity running into a speaker, just a raw speaker cone, and how electronic sound is essentially like an interaction between like the speaker and the physical world and the electrical signal going into it. And I basically just got interested in sort of dissecting that and looking at it from the ground up and looking at how electricity interacts with computation and code and process, and then how that kind of relates back to my own music, my compositional sort of interests. One Bit Symphony basically is an album that we put out a couple years ago now that is one of these microchips with a piece of music that I programmed onto it, and it plays back and you plug in, and it's distributed as a microchip, as a circuit. That project.
All right,
that's very cool.
It's very cool. So to be clear, it's not a recording; it's actually being generated when you turn the thing on.
Yeah,
right?
So that's like one of the consequences of working with this is that the chip itself, it runs at 8 megahertz. It has an 8 kilobyte amount of storage on it that you can program software into, and then have the basically it was a question of how to create a piece of music that could exist on this microchip, and the whole thing had to fit in 8K. So 8K, if you wanted to record something like in CD quality of audio, I think it's like much less than a second. And so there's this kind of information theory problem of how to generate something musical, expressive, interesting, with so little information. And for me, that basically meant writing the composition for the microchip, basically writing the music as a series of numbers that represents pitches and durations and rhythms and patterns and organization of patterns, and this kind of hierarchical way of creating music specifically for this chip that when you turn it on, the chip is basically playing back that score, and you're hearing that live. It's kind of this live synthesis of the music from the data, because the data can be very small. There's very little information in a score. Like notes don't have much, it doesn't take much to represent them, but the way a note is brought to life, for instance on a violin or something, is that's where all the information is, basically. It's a recording, it's a performance.
Let's play a lot of Nintendo, Tristan.
I did. Yeah,
Okay.
I definitely grew up in that generation. But I think that like the sound world that I'm working in is really was for me, I think, most exciting because it connected to these basic ideas from mathematics and from physics, thinking about sort of the foundations of logic, the foundations of the world around us, the foundations of computation, and how the result of that is this like really, really gritty electronic sound. And it so happens, interestingly, that the generation that I grew up with was like this, kind of like early video games generation where sound quality was very poor. It was like the simplest thing that these microchips in these video game consoles could make. And so it sounds the same, and that basically that expressiveness comes out of the fact that it's doing as much as it can with very little, like with limited hardware. And so it's sort of in the same spirit very much. And so I love that music. I love music in video games. And I think that there's a lot of overlap in the sound palette. But what I've really been trying to work towards is something more about like commenting on electricity, commenting on computation and process and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, but it's all connected. I mean, the first album, One Bit Music, I wrote like knee deep in the chiptune scene here in New York. I was playing shows with people who were playing music on their Game Boys. A bunch of friends of mine do that. A bunch of my friends do circuit bending, where they take apart simple electronic toys and turn them into musical instruments. So I was definitely inhabiting that world, and it was really like exciting time to be, where people are exploring these sounds creatively, as opposed to 20 whatever years ago when we were playing these games and kind of just like flooding our brains with the sound palette that really wouldn't come back until much later. So clearly, like we're all like nostalgic for that sound.
One thing that I think is really interesting about chiptunes and the kinds of music that you have playing in this 1-bit architecture is how unabstract it is. There's so many layers of abstraction in a lot of electronic music that we listen to, where all the software that's used to put it together, and then bouncing it in Pro Tools to an audio file, and then getting that thing to somewhere else. This is very direct. One of the things that I liked a lot about getting 1-Bit Symphony was that it came with the source code from the microcontroller, and I thought that was very cool.
So can you reprogram it?
Yeah, sure.
If you had a programmer, I suppose.
I don't think anybody has. I would love for people to really actually learn from it and maybe reprogram it. Actually, the first album, 1-Bit Music, for anybody who actually read the source code, they noticed that there was this kind of like little hitch, this actual hidden track that you can activate if you were to like actually read the source code and understand what it meant. Nobody's told me they've done that yet. So
really, I'm gonna have to dig it up and go through it now.
Go through it, please.
This is for 1-Bit Music or 1-Bit Symphony?
That was for 1-Bit Music. There is no such thing, I'm sorry, 1-Bit Symphony. Or is there? Right. But actually what's been interesting is I've started doing a series of workshops where I'm trying to kind of provide an introduction to programming hardware, to how computers work, by teaching the basics of programming in assembly. And assembly is the language that 1-Bit Symphony is written in, and it's the lowest level computer language. It's the actual instructions that the processor receives. And when you work on that level, you start to begin to feel that the computer is a machine, like almost as if it has gears in it. Like you really get a sense of the mechanics of the language and how the bits in the operations get sort of siphoned out, and actually the structure of the language itself, the structure of the instructions, is like literally mimicked in the hardware itself, and how all the information gets processed. So at the end of the workshop, you often like look at the source code to 1-Bit Symphony, and it's like, oh yeah, like we were just talking about these instructions, and now it like means something. It's really kind of I think it's similar to like the circuit benders who are really about like empowering consumers to say, like this piece of electronics, I don't have to just use it the way it's given to me, but I can claim some ownership over it, and I don't have to just be passive consumer. That's something I'm really interested in hardware and computation, and sort of like teaching people and showing us that we can understand stuff at the lowest level. It might be difficult. You're not going to like understand how like Photoshop works on the lowest level, but you can understand how related things do, and you can see how the sort of stack gets built up from the lowest of the low to like how Ableton works. Sorry, I kind of you were going somewhere with your question about abstraction, and I started talking about something else.
No, it's interesting because, like you said, we use these things all the time, and they seem so mysterious. And it's curious that, you know, something the size of 1-bit music or 1-bit symphony, like my phone, is, you know, that has a multi-core processor and, you know, a gig or two of RAM and you know, how many gigs of storage, I don't know, but these are so complex, and yet they're still so small, and they seem like they should be simple. And this machine that's playing 1-bit symphony is just as small, maybe a little bit smaller, and is very, very simple and relatively easy to understand. So I'm curious about these workshops. Tell us more about these workshops. Who is your I guess your target audience for these workshops? Are you talking to musicians, or are you talking to people that are just generally interested in electronics?
I've done only 3 now, but it's a format that I really want to continue. I think that not too recently my general audience was like the public. Here, let me just turn off this air for a second.
Okay. I want to check out one of these workshops.
I think the people I'm really trying to reach in general is the public, to kind of help us understand that when we use our iPhones and we post a photo on Facebook from some concert we're at, and it's like geocoded to our address, and all this sort of magic is happening, that's like a system that's given to us by some corporations, and there's sort of a power structure behind that. And the more we can understand about the technology, the more we can sort of understand what we're engaging with and what our agency is, and all that sort of those questions. But what's happened basically is that the people at these workshops mostly are sort of tangentially involved in music or something. They were at 2 electronic music festivals in Canada, and then one over here in New York at HU Project Room. So what I've tried to do is to teach them not in the context of learning how to program sound synthesis with hardware. I'm more interested in actually teaching people the basics of hardware programming without any application at all, just kind of as a conceptual introduction to how things work on this level. And so not like looking towards creating an instrument that can play sound or whatever, or do interactive art or something like that, but really just a more abstract introductions, sort of almost like a more mathematical approach. I don't know, that's where I'm at the moment with them, though.
So in that sense, kind of just an intellectual exercise, would you say?
I guess so. I mean, I think it's really meaningful these days, but I don't know, you mentioned like about mystery. I hope there's mystery when people use their smartphones. I'm sort of believing that mystery is slowly getting lost the more and more we are accustomed to them and just kind of take things for granted.
Yeah, people don't wonder anymore.
Yeah, right. But it's true. I guess that's always been true, but we're at an interesting point where these microchips, like the ones I use, which is the size that it is not for any real good reason. Like, they make chips that are that size and much, much more powerful than they are the chips that you find in the iPhone. It just so happens the chips I use are less than $1, and the family of processors has been around, and it's been familiar with, and it's kind of interesting because there's an open source community about it, and so people who want to learn actually really can. But yeah, I don't know. I hope there's there's nothing fundamentally different between the chips that I use and the chip that's in my laptop or the chip that's in my phone. They all, at the bottom level, work exactly the same way. Whether it's one family of Motorola chip or an ARM chip or an Atmel chip or all these companies, they all at the bottom are essentially shuffling information around in the same way. They all have machine languages, and it's all built up exactly the same way. So the operating system you're using, all of the superficial stuff is just that. It's totally superficial. It's just interface for what's happening underneath it. I don't mean for this kind of suddenly sound like a sort of political brand. That's part of it, definitely. but I think, I mean, that's maybe partly also what I'm interested in music. Like I'm sort of a diehard minimalist at heart. I'm interested in process and like examining process and making process very visible and building music out of the intersection and interaction processes. And so it all connects, like in that sense, whether or not it's aesthetic or it's conceptual or scientific.
So,
Well, Tristan, you're really talking our language, though. One of the reasons why we were so interested in having you on is I think everybody on the panel, say Patrick, has actually done some sort of a project using a microcontroller of some sort.
Uh-huh.
And you were talking about doing these workshops as sort of an abstract intellectual endeavor to just kind of learn how it works in a general way. And I think that's very important. I did some work working in a liberal education environment, doing a fellowship when I was doing my doctorate. And I really pushed a lot to get the students to try and learn the basics of programming. As an example, like, I'm not a great programmer. I can fumble my way through making very, very, very basic things work using an Arduino or something. But Nate and Dave are pretty sharp coders. The point is not that I know how to code really well. It's that I know enough to talk to them intelligently about a project we're working on that involves coding. I understand how it works and the logic of it, and it sort of demystifies the computer. People subscribe sort of personalities to their computers because it's got all these glitches and they have trouble dealing with it. And then when you're dealing with a microcontroller and you're actually programming it and seeing the results, like you were saying, you think of it as like a little machine all of a sudden. And it's sort of, and you used my favorite buzzword, agency. It gives you a certain sense of agency with your the gear you're working with. So I'm really into that idea. I wish like something along this line was being incorporated into undergraduate education. I think it's very important.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I think you put it really well, that you don't need to understand all of programming. You really just need to have the slightest taste at the beginning. And then you can see like the whole world. You can kind of step back and you can see how everything fits together. And you can say, oh, I don't have enough time or interest to like pursue this, but that doesn't mean you don't understand the basics of it. And to me, like you're talking about incorporating to school, I feel the same way. I think like programming is a basic science in my mind. It should be taught like alongside biology and chemistry and physics because it's understanding the world around us. And when I was a little kid, we didn't spend day and like all day, all night on our laptops interacting with the world through technology, but we do now. And we interact with the world more through technology than we do through, I don't know, biology or mathematics anymore. And so these are things we should understand, the way we do how, the atoms in this desk fit together.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think it's a matter of literacy, like to be considered literate in our time with the things that surround us, that should be a part of it, is to have some kind of basic understanding of what's going on just a little bit below the surface of OS 10 or Windows or iOS or whatever it is, to understand when how the world around you works. And that's I think a lot of the part of linguistic literacy is to understand when you see things in the world around you, how to understand them and how to interact with them.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm curious. Sorry, Patrick, did you have a question? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I had one.
Oh, Nate, go for it.
I was just wondering. So you say that Tristan, you have a background in music, but how did you get so deep into the world of electronics and like?
Yeah. Good. Yeah. I mean, actually, I'd been a programmer my whole life. I remember middle school learning to program HyperCard. I don't know if any of you guys know that.
Oh wow.
But I
Back in the
loved
day.
it as a hobby, like writing simple video games or simple sort of shareware programs and posting them on AOL and that was a lot of fun. And
Do you still have those? Can we have them?
I have like some documentation about them. I found like in my old home, like these binders with maps drawn out, of course, of like Final
SoundNotion
Fantasy
TV
type
will
games.
also be a video game distributor coming up
Yeah.
soon.
Absolutely.
But
But
you can only run the video games in BASIC.
Right.
I actually did make one microprocessor-based video game just for the fun of it, kind of adapting a video art piece into sort of like this like super low-res 1-bit video, like kind of lame fighter jet game, but it's ridiculously hard. So we've put it up at like some music shows sometimes, and a friend of mine started this video game collective here in New York called Baby Castles, and they basically interject independent video game arcades, independently made games within independently made cabinets into like the music scene, at least here in New York, and then they've grown beyond the music scene. But there's a great kind of overlap of these worlds, and so I don't know.
I'll have to check that out.
That's fantastic.
Seriously great. It's really, really great here.
I'm curious. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. There's a little Skype delay, so you should always feel free to talk over us.
Okay. But wait, no, I did want to finish the question of how to get to programming, and within the context of music, which is that like I've been programming that shareware stuff like my whole childhood, and on the other end of the spectrum, I was writing music, but like really just composing for classical ensembles, and I remember in college especially like having everybody incorporating electronics into their work and really questioning that. I didn't have any sort of substance to hold on to in electronic sound. This is just where I was at as a composer. I was really interested in these classical instruments and their physical limitations and their physical expressiveness, and writing for that had some meaning that writing for the computer just it didn't connect to me. It didn't have like some resonance. And then that rate's basically all changed when I started working with these microprocessors, these microchips, because all of a sudden writing code had these, like, you had a physical sense of the execution of the code. It wasn't just abstracted, like we keep saying. It wasn't just running on your LCD screen. It was outputting electricity, and the electricity was generating sound.
Yeah.
And that's when everything came together, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that lots of composers have been canonized composers have been really intrigued by math, and from music to math is a pretty natural jump, and I think obviously coding to math and back and forth is a natural jump. And it's interesting that whereas somebody like Xenakis might be deep in math, but it's kind of like to help him compose, and all the mathematical processes that he's thinking of are kind of buried deep within his process. With this, it's like you're able to sort of, give the math straight to the listener, if you know what I mean. It's like a direct connection.
I mean, I think that it's sort of one and the same in a way. Mathematics is a language, whether or not it's executed. And programming, too, is a language, whether or not it's done by us with pencil and paper or run on a computer. So it can either happen during the composition process. It can kind of inform ideas that become creative impulses for a piece of music, or it can be done live in the concert hall or, just before your headphones. So I think that for me, I was just, we're all talking about kind of the same processes. And for me, it was just kind of making those integral to the experience itself, not before the experience. And so it's just kind of codifying these processes that we've all already been thinking about, how, patterns of notes fit together, and then how that's actually created and physics behind that and math behind that. I'm just kind of trying to get that as close to the listener as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Well, another thing that we're all pretty interested, I know at least Dave, Nate, and I are very interested in, is fabricating objects, like the DIY vibe. And Dave, we've talked and talked and talked. Let's see it. Let's see the 1-bit symphony. Dave has plugged straight into it. Plugged straight.
I don't know if we're probably not going to play too much of this because we're going to play a lot more of another piece later in the show. But this is the 1-bit symphony. It's a little worse for wear after my last move, but it'll still rock.
Doesn't reproduce too well over.
Not a lot of things do. So that's just a little bit of it, and you should definitely check it out because Cantaloupe is still making these things, right?
We're in between production runs. We finished up the first run, and it's going to be another 1 or 2 months before hopefully we get a new batch of them and stuff.
Okay.
But you can pre-order it and help support the new production finances and get a copy as soon as it's ready. Yeah.
Now, have you heard this piece performed on, or not performed, but played on like Q2 or any radio station? Because what I imagine what they have to do if they want to play it is throw it in Soundflower or some kind of program that will actually make a recording of it on your device, then put it into their stream.
Yes and no. I mean, it's like an MP3 release of this thing, for better or worse.
So there is an MP3 release.
Yeah, and it's because at the end of the day, it's music.
Right.
I think
I mean, it does. I think it does. It's so great to have the actual thing, though. I mean, like that's the beauty of this.
Yeah, right.
Of this composition,
Of course, if we could all like have string quartet perform in our living room every time we wanted to listen to a piece of music.
Right.
We clearly want that too. That'd be much more meaningful and engaging. But still, at the end of the day, it's a piece of music, and I do believe that people should be able to experience things however they want to. If they buy it, hopefully, if they steal it, I can't stop that. So people will listen as they want to, and so we've kind of put it out there for that. And I don't know, I've got it on my iPod, and once in a while, if I don't happen to have the CD case with me, because remember when we all used to have to carry our CDs around in Logic cases,
right?
And like load them up every time. It's nice to have on hand for that like walk home.
Yeah.
I just have to ask, who does your soldering for these runs?
Yeah, I've got an incredible team of assistants working on this project.
Cool.
And I like to say I do it too, but I did a few at the beginning, and then I was like, just hand this over to the production team.
Yeah.
So they do them all by hand. This is all handmade, and it will continue to be handmade. And it's a lot of work.
Yeah, I always imagine some really unfortunate assistants at Cantaloupe Records, like sitting in a room soldering and super gluing things to CD cases all day.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit like that, but we try to make it a fun time.
Sure.
Do it in the studio.
No, I'm not trying to accuse you of running a sweatshop or anything.
We do.
I imagine them looking up YouTube videos on how to solder.
Yeah.
Tristan, do you have any other projects in the works that are going to be physical object distributed, if you know what I mean?
I'm thinking about stuff. I'm trying to figure out what's next. Right now, I'm starting a recording project of my composed pieces,
Cool.
Which at the end of the day will just be audio files. So whether that in that case, the music has to speak for itself, but starting tomorrow, I'm going to the studio and beginning to record these pieces. And I'm really excited about that, actually, because those are the pieces that the 1-bit electronics come to life in a more performance context, where I have speakers on stage, speaker cones connected to circuit boards that I've created, and like the first piece we're recording is Active Field. It's for 10 violins and 10 speakers connected to 1-bit electronics, each one. And so it's the synthesis of kind of the world I came from, scoring music for classical instrumentation, with this electronic world. And I guess like when you listen to One Bit Symphony and you're listening in your headphones and it's a personal experience and the sound's very close to your ears, the sound is still coming out of speakers in space. They just happen to be your own speakers inside your ears. And so with these compositions, it's putting those speakers on stage, kind of creating a more sculptural space wherein the speakers are and the musicians, and it's being mixed in the air, and it's a very live experience, even though there's electronics involved. So I'm really, really, really excited to start kind of recording those pieces well and getting those out.
I'm curious. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm curious about how you think of the composing that goes into these microchip pieces, and maybe how that relates to the pieces that you're writing for instruments, for traditional instruments. Because it seems like one of the things that when I heard about this music that was written for these microprocessors, it sounds at first like a little bit of a gimmick, and then when I heard it, I was really impressed with the music itself. And like you said, at the end of the day, the thing is a sound object, the music. And while the method of producing it is non-trivial, it's at the end of the day, it's a piece of music. I hate that expression, the end of the day. Anyway, it's a piece of music. And I'm curious about how you're the way you think about the music relates to the process of making it, and then how that might apply to non-microchip pieces.
Yeah, it's been a lot of back and forth since I started working with this stuff. I've been writing just purely acoustic music, still sort of being interested in minimalist processes, and then put out One Bit Music, that first album, where I had to actually write the music in code. I didn't have any framework yet that I could sort of listen and write as I listened. I'd have to program a sequence of numbers and download it onto the device and listen, and then like 2 minutes into the piece, I'm like, if I don't like that pitch, I'm going to reprogram it and then listen again from scratch. And, but then I started thinking about incorporating electronics into composed work, and I came to the conclusion that I wanted to adapt the pitch system of the electronics to match the sort of Western, chromatic 12-tone system that we have typically. And that was kind of like an interesting compromise, because I realized that even though when you're working with code, pitch system is arbitrary. There are a lot of arbitrary things. In fact, our 12-tone system is based on irrational numbers that really don't code very well. So I could go the route of just information and start thinking that way. But I realized that musically, I was still more interested in the sort of the system that, for me, really came from growing up being a pianist, playing a keyboard and thinking in terms of the geometry of the keyboard. Mm-hmm. And so I started writing those pieces, and gradually, went back and forth. It was like, what do I have to say for electronics and violins, or what do I have to say for electronics and crotales, or and low wind instruments, or and accordions, and all these. Each piece became kind of an investigation of the relationship and the possibilities and what there was to explore physically and conceptually, musically, aesthetically, all these things between like a new set of instruments to work with and these electronics. And so it went back and forth, and sometimes the processes were more growing from patterns, thinking about code and electronics, and sometimes it was more fitting the electronics to think to processes that fit more naturally into the instruments. And then when it came to One Bit Symphony, I sort of was free from all the instruments again, and I got to kind of like really just dive into what was possible with electronics in terms of I was really interested in narrowing down and kind of getting much more intersection going on between lines of music and stuff. Anyway, that's a long story to say basically that these days I'm I'm finding more and more that I'm writing music that has to do with sort of more like ideas that come more from code, more from sequences of numbers than I was in the past.
That's really interesting that the method has informed the process so much.
Absolutely, yeah. I think whenever you write your own software, you have to tell it what to do, and it can only do what you've told it to do.
Right.
And so I think that's a very different approach, for instance, from when people work, even in like Max MSP or something, where you're really, you're not so much telling it, you're kind of, it's like a little bit more ambiguous.
Yeah.
Like in Ableton Live or something, or in regular desktop sequencer software, like clearly operating within its paradigm, its parameters. When it gets to Max MSP, there's this sort of programming language. It's a lot more open-ended, but you're still stuck with these structures that it gives you. But then when you write code from scratch, you're really defining what is possible, what music means. And what music means in one-bit symphony is sequences of notes and rhythms that then get sequenced within a composition. And that's the start and end of what that music, the sort of the possible universe of that music is.
That's really interesting, because when I think of the one-bit music, the first thing that occurs to me is how much more limiting it is than sitting down at a computer. But you're saying that when you sit down at a full desktop computer, you're making a selection of software, and that in itself is limiting. But it's interesting that you're saying that you feel more free with the one-bit processor. Though, would you say that it's still pretty focusing to sit down to look at one bit at a time?
Yeah, totally. I think that it's to each his own, basically.
Sure.
For me, I look at this processor more in terms of its expressiveness than its limitations. The same way when you look at a flute or something and you say, well, like, you talk about what the flute can do. You don't talk about what the flute can't do. Like, it can't play. You can't like just play a totally high fidelity recording of a top 40 music hit through like with your mouth on a flute or something. And you would never even think to do that. It's almost absurd to try to imagine how that could even be possible. But so you think about its expressiveness, not its limitations. And I think that that's, for me, the crux with working with these chips is that I really just see them purely as like things to explore and to find out what they can do, the same way as people who are doing extended technique work are like excited by the idea of continuing to explore, what could be possible with something.
Well, I think that's a great place to end it, and we move on to the headlines. So you guys think that's all right?
I have one more quick question.
Oh, okay.
So, Tristan, you're a pianist?
I used to be, yeah. I still am. I'm actually
former life.
I've written very, very little piano music, but I'm actually writing now a big piece. I noticed you guys interviewed Vicky Chow recently.
Yeah.
And, I'm doing an evening-length piece for her in 40-channel electronics, so 40 speakers on stage.
Only 40? What's the problem?
Right. Well, the 50 violin piece, 50 channels, that's a little large later down the line. But yeah, actually, so yeah, sorry, I cut you off. So piano, what were you gonna say?
No, I was just wondering if, I didn't know if what your musical background was like. Did you play in band or anything like that? I certainly don't think you sat there with a microprocessor in beginning band. You were in beginning band.
Yeah, no. Although, yeah, I mean, I played in a rock band in middle school and in high school and a little bit in college until I realized I just didn't have the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do remember in whatever 7th grade or something, our band, I gave the keyboardist this line to play in this song that I'd written. It was the polyrhythm, and it was like together, right, left, right, together, right, left, right. Like how to play the simple 2-on-3 polyrhythm, and think of it rote instead of it, these overlapping meters. So I don't know. Yeah. So I did all that stuff.
You can get a chip to do that stuff really easily.
Really easily.
Chips have great senses of rhythm.
They swing
Although it's
pretty
funny
hard.
that, like, if you happen to buy more than one copy of One Bit Symphony, you'll realize that each one is slightly different pitched. And it's because the chips, while they ostensibly run at an internal clock rate of 8 megahertz, the clock, it's called an RC clock, and it's kind of hard to tune properly. So each one will be a little bit off. And in fact, everything's always a little bit off. There's always a tolerance, we say, of like plus or minus a few percentage points on the clock speed. So, so that's kind of manifest itself in the fact that these machines are self-contained environments. They don't know, how fast time is going by outside of them. So I can tell them to make a 440 hertz, middle A tone, but that's relative to what they are told their clock rate is. And so their sense of rhythm is perfect insofar as you give them a sense of time.
Right.
That's awesome.
Seeming somehow pretty organic, these machines as well.
Yeah, definitely.
It's interesting.
That's cool. All right. So
Cool.
on to the news, Dave.
Sure. We had breaking news last week, if you recall.
Well, there's breaking news in Chicago again this week. It's actually tragic news for the picket sign industry in Chicago.
The ink had not even dried yet on the Chicago Symphony Orchestra's picket signs before they reached a new agreement with the orchestra. So they
They're
are...
like, okay.
So what?
They're like, okay.
Okay, fine. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, so they are back to work. Congratulations to them. Atlanta is also getting back to performing,
Which is so great because both Chicago and Atlanta are scheduled to be at Carnegie Hall this season. Chicago opening Carnegie Hall season, and Atlanta at Carnegie Hall on October 27th. So if both of those had not happened, that would have been pretty ridiculous.
There's still some things to iron out in Atlanta, though, right?
Well, they signed a deal that expires in 2 or 3 years, didn't they?
Well, they all expire in 2 or 3 years.
Well, I mean,
I think everything's pretty much on the road to goodness.
I think they're
as
good to
it
go.
is.
Speaking of Carnegie Hall, this didn't make it into the rundown, but did you guys hear Spring for Music is ending after 2014?
Yeah, after 2014.
That's a bummer.
Is this just not enough money?
I guess so. One thing that we've been talking about orchestras this last couple of weeks because it's the start of the orchestra season, and orchestras that haven't started are making news for having not started, which is weird. But we always wonder whether we should put in these stories in the rundown about orchestras, because orchestras are, I think, in a lot of ways becoming less and less relevant to what we do as composers and what the new music community is interested in. We see a lot more composers interested in chamber music, in solo music, and as Tristan is electronic
Chiptune.
music. So I sometimes wonder, I don't know, Tristan, do you think it's worth us as composers concerning ourselves with what's going on in the orchestra world?
Sure. I mean, that's part of our community. I don't think I have much to say there, but
Right, and I think that's kind of what we end up saying. The reason we put them in the end is because these are our community. Even when we're not writing for orchestras, we're writing for individual musicians who oftentimes play in orchestras and earn a living that way as well. So yeah, I mean it's just a question that it often comes up when we're talking about orchestras. Some more orchestra news.
hold on.
What?
Norman Lebrecht, he had an interesting take on the strike in Chicago.
Oh.
And something I wanted to cover.
Okay, hit it.
Players, and he has these 3 lessons that should be learned. that
Oh
he
yeah,
lists.
this is good.
Norman Lebrecht never falls short of trying to be controversial or stick it in somebody's face. Players in luxury orchestras, I love that, luxury orchestras cannot afford to strike. In 2012, musicians with an average pay of $175,000 cannot expect much solidarity when their fellow professionals across the land are enduring savage pay cuts and lockouts.
Where's that salary figure from?
Well,
I
their
don't know.
base is one. The base in their last contract was 140 something, with an average in the 170s. I don't remember exactly what the numbers were.
The average orchestra in the orchestra?
No.
music in
The
United
average
States?
in the Chicago Symphony. We're just talking about Chicago here.
Yeah. Now, the cost of living in Chicago is high, but I don't think it's that high.
They have excellent public transportation.
That's right. His third rule is the segue we use to get to the next story, Dave. The American way of running orchestras needs to change. He's basically throwing down the gauntlet saying, these problems aren't happening by accident. It's because we're dealing with what does he call it? It's awesome. The kind of dinosaur play we're seeing in Atlanta, Minnesota, St. Paul, Chicago, and elsewhere looks lumbering and ridiculous in the 21st century. And I would have to agree, they got to figure out how to do something differently. And you know who is calling for them to do something differently?
Who's that, Sam?
Zachary Wolf.
See how I played into that?
That's right. Back my play, baby. Zachary Wolf brought the hammer down on the season opening concerts.
The gala concerts.
Yeah, of the New York Phil. Made two big points. The first concert, which was held not at, where was it? Avery Fisher Hall, was what he called a little more adventurous, but still not that adventurous as far as new music goes. And then Zachary Wolf is calling the official opening night was the next week. And that's when they did Respighi, two pieces by Respighi. And then they had Itzhak Perlman come out and do some short kind of character pieces, just fun, cool pieces. So very lightweight, some delicious sounding tone poems and Itzhak Perlman ripping it up.
I know Itzhak doesn't have to do anything he doesn't want to do anymore, but does it seem a little exploitative to anybody else to trot him out there every so often?
He has a schedule just like everyone else has a schedule.
Yeah,
he performs quite a bit.
I know, but I mean he's getting up there. And the reviews are saying that he's struggling.
Yeah. The thing that's amazing to me about him is, I'm probably the oldest person on the panel. And I remember from being a little kid, before I was in music at all, I'm like, who's that sweaty guy on crutches? What's he doing? And that's Itzhak Perlman. He's a great player. And I remember when I was a little kid going, oh, and I learned what polio was. And I thought, oh, well, look at that. But
when you were a little kid, he could play.
Yeah. And
it's not that he can't play anymore. That was rude. I shouldn't have said that.
It was a cool lesson, and I think a very early lesson for me in like people who have disabilities or something like that, like not being limited. I mean, this is a very after school special kind of thing, but I was a little kid when I saw him the first time, and I remember being very fascinated.
Half the battle.
I remember being very fascinated by the fact that he had overcome that and was, this big time concert violinist.
Still going too.
So anyway, there's actually inside the article that Zachary Wolf wrote, he links to another article he had written where he basically really throws down the gauntlet on the Phil not playing anything new. So they need to get with it.
And so they've separated these concerts now between the concerts where they play interesting things and the concerts where they play basically top 40 classical.
Yeah, the overworked war horses that the Blue Hair subscription people want to hear.
Oh man, beating the dead war horses is too good to leave alone.
Beating the dead war horses, yes.
It's so weird that museums don't have this problem. Like with ticket sales, things like that. Then I never hear about, well, geez, MoMA's really doing badly right now.
Well, that's because you can take the most,
I think it's a difference in the art. I think it's a difference in the art, Sam.
I think it's because visual dissonance doesn't affect people the way, auditory dissonance.
Well, that's what I mean too. And you have, you can move along at your own pace. It's a social event. You can talk. It's completely different.
That's exactly right.
It's so different that I'm not sure that it bears comparison.
That's what I'm saying.
Well, we talk about, the arts are losing money. The arts are losing money. I went to MoMA on Friday, and I got to tell you,
Yeah, and you could go to the New York Philharmonic, and I bet they're doing okay too.
Well, it's
but
'cause the New York
you got to
Philharmonic-
talk. You're talking about this really narrow, like the upper crust is always going to be there. The New York Philharmonic isn't going anywhere any day soon. But
Chicago
and neither is MoMA, neither is the Guggenheim.
Philadelphia.
But there are little museums all over the country and all over the world, really, that are losing money, that are shutting down, and are having a lot of problems just keeping the doors open. And
that's also the case in the like with Philadelphia.
Well, Philadelphia, I would say, is an outlier. Philadelphia had some idiots running the show.
Cleveland had a problem. I mean, these aren't like bad orchestra. These are upper crust orchestras, like you say. I don't know. I think there's something different. We need more research.
Yes.
Let's hire an intern.
Okay.
We can give people college credit for Googling things. Right?
All right.
That's a thing.
Well, that's assuming that interns that are like undergraduates know how to Google things, which they don't. How to effectively Google something is something else they need to teach.
Wow, that's a tangent that we just got onto there.
Yes.
So, speaking of nothing that we were just talking about,
Speaking of making some new stuff,
okay.
there you go.
So Bill Edens had a great blog post this week. If you don't read Bill Edens' blog, it's two people write this blog, Bill Edens and I'm blanking on the other guy.
Ron Spiegelman.
Ron Spiegelman, yes. They write Sticks and Drones blog, which is on the Inside the Arts network. You should check it out. It's really good. But Bill Edens is talking about all of the struggles that the arts are having, and he has decided that he wants to go and make his own record label. It's yet another artist-owned record label, again, for classical musicians. It's certainly not the only one like this. Tristan, you're involved with Cantaloupe, which is very artist-dominated, of course. What's what I'm thinking of? New Amsterdam. A lot of these record labels are popping up. Irritable Hedgehog. Artists are tired of dealing with people that aren't interested in the music that they're making as much as they are in the money they might make or not make on the music that is being made. So Bill Edens is setting up or has set up a studio in his own backyard, and I am totally jealous of the studio that he has set up basically like in a shed in his backyard, but is really fancy. And he's going it alone. He's got a project now on USA Projects, which we've talked about a little bit before. We should get somebody from USA Projects on the show sometime. It's like Kickstarter or Indiegogo. It's a crowdfunding site that is specifically for the arts, and it's a nonprofit, so donations through USA Projects are tax deductible. It's a really cool thing. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, you should definitely go over to USA Projects and check out this one. It's weird to say USA Projects project, but you should check it out. We'll have a link to that on the site.
It's HEAR Projects. HEAR, which is Help Empower Artist Recordings.
So that's Bill's project.
Yeah. And
so that's the name of his project on USA Projects.
Correct. And by the way, if you look at the blog post that we'll have a link to, and you see the picture of the recording space with a grand piano sitting in it, it doesn't look much like a shed, Dave.
I'm aware of that.
It looks more like the lobby of a nice hotel.
That's why I think it's so. That's why it's so remarkable to me, is how amazing it looks.
Got that Edmonton flair.
The Edmonton flair, is that a thing?
Yeah. Never mind.
Sorry.
I'm
missing something.
Tristan?
Yo.
Yes. You obviously have, at least in some point in your career, used notation software, right?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Are you a Finale or a Sibelius man, or do you just code some kind of language to do the notation?
No, although I've been tempted more recently, I've been using Sibelius for many years now. But a friend of mine, I was just thinking about recently, I forget what the software was, but it basically was like a programming language-based music notation software, which to me
Lily
makes
Pond or
a
something.
lot of sense.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I don't remember. It was like 8 years ago or something like that. But I'm starting to think more about that because of this new recording project where I might be kind of publishing some scores to go along with the music. And so I'm thinking about formatting and stuff like that. So, yeah, I don't really have much to contribute in that conversation.
Yeah, we'll
That's all right.
check back with you on that later.
I was just asking because the last story in the rundown is the last. Well, Dave, since this is so close to your heart, I'll let you talk about this one.
It's not a huge deal. And we talked about Avid making some big changes in the Sibelius team a couple of months ago on the show. It was announced that they're going to be shutting down the operation in the UK. This still has many of the people that initially created the very first editions of Sibelius 15 years ago or so, 15, 20 years ago. They're shutting down that office. They are getting rid of all of the people that created the software, and they're moving the production to the same places where they develop the rest of their Avid software. And it's really sad because a lot of these people have been there for a really long time. They have great ties to the user community. And just last week, they released the last update that they're going to be involved in to Sibelius. So those guys are all going to be, they probably won't be unemployed, but they won't be employed by Avid by the end of October. So we're sad to see them go. Particularly visible member of that group is Daniel Spreadbury, who did a lot of customer support and worked very closely with the people that wrote the software. So thanks to Daniel and the Sibelius UK team, and hopefully we'll still be interested in using Sibelius when it's being written by other people.
Yes, make us happy and prove us wrong about all of our predictions, please.
Would love to hear it.
Yes.
It's time, Sam.
The pick of the week.
That still cracks me up. I don't know why. I think it's the part where you like reach off to the side to turn something on and then go back to the microphone.
I can't reach the effects return.
Oh my God. All right. What's the pick of the week?
Oh, the pick of the week is from a new record just released last week. It's from Mariel Roberts. It's called Non-Extraneous Sounds, and the piece that we're going to listen to is Formations, and it's written by our guest, Tristan Perich. So we're going to listen to a little excerpt of this. Tristan, do you have any thing you want to say to maybe set this up before we listen to it?
Sure, yeah. It's a piece that Mariel commissioned for this album for cello and 6-channel electronics. So there are 6 speakers on stage along with the cello, and it's just a piece that I think, what do I want to say about it? It's a really jubilant piece for me. It's sort of like a celebration of this sort of cloud of 1-bit sound that you can get when you do things extremely fast and have these very, very small units of melodic patterns happening that kind of create a cloud of electronic sound that really is about putting the cello center stage. So it's really sort of setting up this sound background for Mariel's playing. And she had a great release party a couple nights ago at Issue Project Room here in New York, and really ripped it up. So hope you guys like the recording.
All right. So here, Sam?
Just so you know that we're going to play like usually we play a fairly small chunk, but because, like you said, your music is pretty minimalistic and process-based, it's kind of hard to listen to 20 seconds or 30 seconds of something. Feel for it. We're going to hear a chunk at the beginning, and then the chunk that I thought was really cool in the middle, and then at about 12 and a half minutes, when you finally get some big, jubilant cello payoff. So,
sorry, Mariel, I didn't know they were going to cut it up.
But we will have links to purchase the track on iTunes and Amazon.
You should definitely get the whole thing because it's really cool. Definitely worth your while. So here's some excerpts from Formations. That was an excerpt of Formations by our guest Tristan Perich, performed on the new Mariel Roberts album, Non-Extraneous Sounds. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's going to sound, by the way, we should say, better in the recording than it did live over Skype. So
he supports it locally right there. So
yeah.
But yeah, to me, that I really enjoyed that piece. I listened to it this morning, and the section in the middle where the cello is really getting active is impressive from a technical point, because it's so demanding tempo wise and all this. But the last part to me is like you're going, yeah, even though the cello is just playing, But that's the first time you get any sort of like that low growling cello, and it really is effective. It's a good payoff after having listened to the whole process unfold.
The chip sounds, I think, are a nice foil for the cello as well. Oh, I lost you.
Tristan, I think your mic may still be muted.
I'm still muted. There we go. So you didn't hear me saying thanks for the compliments. Thank you. Yeah, no, I really like. It's funny because I think when I was writing this piece, my mind was in a really high pitched world a lot of the time. I've really been kind of getting really into like the really high pitched sounds of 1-bit electronics because they're so piercing and so kind of pure. And this piece, it starts off with the cello in the higher range, but by that end part, it's really like got this amazing warmth that just fills the palette.
Is that a decision you made because of what you were hearing in your mind then? Were you trying to temper the composition by really introducing kind of a lower sound?
Oh, I think I just wanted to get into that sound world that like the cello speaks so beautifully down there. And I just that was a juxtaposition that I thought that would work at that point, I guess. Because at the first part of the piece is sort of like the slow descent down towards the low open C, and so then that's sort of where it peaks off again. These more wide chords, open chords.
It's interesting how the roles seem to shift through the piece. I'm curious about how you think about the role of the the 1-bit sounds and the role of the cello, because sometimes it feels like the cello is floating on top of the 1-bit sounds, and other times it seems like the cello is kind of subsumed by all the crazy filigree in the chip side.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of my pieces have been for like multiple voices in an ensemble, like 10 violins in this piece I'm recording now. And I haven't written much solo musician work, and when I have, it's more been one-on-one, like the solo vibraphone piece with like 2 cello electronics, and there's just really dialogue between 2 hands and the vibraphonist and two speakers. But this piece, and I have a piece for harpsichord and 4-channel electronics, are these pieces where the live musician is really just one voice in an ensemble. And it's exciting for me because it allows the processes to kind of get spread out like across multiple voices, but still have the live voice be an important part of that. It gets tricky when it's like I find that mixing this piece, there's a really, really fine, delicate balance between too much cello, too much electronics. And flip side is too little cello, too little electronics, because they kind of have different functions. And it's really supposed to be well integrated, and you're not, at least the beginning of the piece, it's a really closely knit world, except for, it kind of moves in and out of that. And I guess in a way that's what the line does. It's sort of these lines that hover at a single pitch and then start oscillating, and the cello comes out, more when it's oscillating, and then it settles on another pitch again, and it starts oscillating again. So it's this constant moving back and forth between being one with the sort of shimmeriness and then being its own voice.
Yeah, to me, the effect is, it's sort of like you hear the cello and the electronics as one thing at the beginning.
Yeah.
And it's sort of splitting them. The most profound example is finally when we get this low C, definitely cello and electronics, not the same thing,
Right.
So,
right.
Very effective. And I would love to see this piece live, though.
Yeah.
Is cello mic'd in some way? Is it also being amplified, or it seems like
like the harpsichord piece, this is one of those pieces where electronics, the piece that needs to be kind of loud. It doesn't really work as a quiet piece. And that means that the musician needs to be amplified. And that's something I still have qualms for. I keep thinking, well, what if we play this in a really small room? We can make it loud, but and not have to use amplification. Because I've really, throughout my work, stayed away from amplification, because I think it's, if you're going to see a live concert, you're there to see musicians making air move and listening to the result of that, the sound that's created by them playing. And the last thing you want to have happen is have that mic'd and run through like 2 stereo speakers, and so you're reducing all of the sound of the space and everything that's coming from that instrument down to a single point source where the microphone is. But that's not the end of the story, because amplification is meaningful in the context of allowing this piece to really live the way it's supposed to live, which is really meant to be a loud piece. So when we do it, the ideal setup is having the 6 speakers on their own on stage, and then the cello mics running into an amp. And ideally, the amp is sitting next to the cello, so the sound's localized in some way. Or if it's going to be a really big place, I want a mic on each speaker, so we're actually micing the speakers as if they're an ensemble. But it's tricky, because miking stuff is always tricky. It's nothing that I've mastered yet. So, but that's interesting challenge.
Do you specify like a spacing for the speakers on stage or anything in the score? Like, is it spaced out as much as possible, or?
It really depends. I mean, I generally like the idea of an arc behind the cellist. Mm-hmm. And the wider the arc, the more you're going to be able to separate sound in your listening experience from one speaker to the next. But we've also played it with her sitting within the line of the speakers. I don't remember if we did it behind them, but it's really like the venue often dictates what the ideal setup is. But it's still like, I mean, within some parameters, it's still a directional piece. You know, there's still this relationship with, you know, Mariel on stage with the speakers and audience sort of like facing that. But what I keep coming back to, and when I'm thinking about the ideal presentation of my music, is like a gallery space where you're sort of in the music, where you're not separated from it, where you're not in like a audience with the lights down, so you're really focused on this performer in another space that's sort of separate from your own stage. I'd much rather have an awareness of how the sound is being created in the same space as you, and how it's you know, the same air that you're breathing is the air that's bringing the sound to you, and all this stuff. So like galleries, for instance, are really kinds of venues that I like most. And of course, there you don't have to amplify as much. And
Galleries have been very kind to new music people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious, in the official audio recording release, is it encoded to playback in surround sound?
No, it was recorded up at MPAC, and I don't know. Actually, I'll ask Mariel what's happening with those files, but that's something that's tricky too, because, or at least for me, I don't know. I don't have a comment on what future plans might be for this one, but surround sound audio is just as much an emulation of music as stereo sound audio is, unless we're having unless the piece is specifically written for 5.1 or whatever channel sound, or like a Janet Cardiff piece where the voices are tied to the speakers within the space. You're still just going to be hearing this like 5.1 channel mix down of something that was mic'd and in a space, and the chances are that the mix is not going to exactly correlate to the miking and everything. So it's still this artificial like construct. Of course, it'll sound a lot richer, but I wonder at some point if that richness is like superficial, if you're just kind of, if it's really adding to the music or if it's distracting. I don't know. I don't have enough to say about that yet.
Yeah. It's really cool to hear about your process and your ideas behind all the music that you make, like especially the electronics, as like all the different voices being different instruments on stage and each having their own speaker. Like thinking about it like a soloist with electronics as a chamber piece, that's just the coolest thing.
Well, thanks. I'm glad you like it.
Well, I think we should probably end it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Tristan.
Thank you.
Do you have anything in particular coming up that you want to plug before we go?
Oh man, I'm really my brain is so focused on the spring with this big piece for Vicky Chow and a big piece for me and Perkins duo, big percussion piece for them. And so I don't even remember what my schedule is like, but I know a bunch of my pieces are being performed here and there. One's over at the Venice Biennale next week or 2 weeks or whatever from now. Something up at Mass Mocha, we're doing a harpsichord piece there, I think on November 1st. And I don't know where your listeners are, but check my
worldwide, really.
Yeah. We'll link to your website, and if you're interested in hearing Tristan's music, you can do your own research. You can do your own Google searching.
Please do. Thanks.
You can also find on our site links to all of the stories that we talked about. You can find links to places where you can buy the full recordings of Tristan's piece. So please go ahead and do that. That's soundnotion.tv/SN. Thanks to everyone who is watching live and joining us in chat. We do the show every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And so you can watch soundnotion.tv/live.
We've got one message from the chat room.
What's
asking
that?
to talk about the New Cantaloupe project as well.
The New Cantaloupe project.
It's such in early terms that I don't know what I can even really what's finalized, what's going to happen. But
we have a Cantaloupe insider in chat.
But I am really excited to be able to start recording my composed work and kind of start a long-term project that will allow me to kind of work through those pieces.
Well, when that long-term project comes together a little bit more, we'd love to have you back on to talk about it.
Of course, we'd be happy to.
So stay tuned to SoundNotion.tv for that as well. You can continue this conversation with us on our site, soundnotion.tv/SN, or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. We're at SoundNotion. We're also all individually on Twitter. If you'd like to support our show, there are links on our site. We just added a new thing on the site this week. It's an Amazon.com search box thing. So if you'd like to support us, and this is totally free to you, just go in next time you're buying anything, whatever it is on Amazon, just get there through our search box and we'll get a tiny little commission. Doesn't cost you anything, and we get a little bit from that. So we would appreciate your help there. This show and all our shows are available in the iTunes store, so you can go there, subscribe for free, and catch every episode downloaded directly to your device. SoundNotion's introduction includes music by Patrick Gullo and video by Tyler Lepp. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you back next week.
Thanks, guys.